adventurers, and welcome to Skill Tree, where we learn how to do just about everything. Alright, so picture this. You're a ranger, or maybe a wanderer on a pilgrimage somewhere. You find yourself out in the wilds of a strange land, and the weather starts to turn dark and stormy. If only there was a way for some, quick shelter for you from the storm. Well, have no fear, Wanderer, because today we're going to make something special just for you. So this idea came at me actually from our Halloween live stream. Check it out right here. But during it, one of you who were watching mentioned that it would be cool if we had a backpack of some sort that became a tent. And you know I love things that become other things. It's like my jam. So that's what we're gonna do today. And like you, fair wanderer, we have a lot of ground to cover. So let's jump right into it and level up this skill. Okay, right to the most important part is the shelter/bag itself. Now, I want this thing to be made out of a material that's lightweight and fairly strong, but also isn't gonna break the bank in case you wanna try to make one of these yourself. I ended up going with this canvas drop cloth that I got from the hardware store. It's exactly the same material I used for my cloak build up here, and so far I've been really impressed with the durability of the fabric and just how well it stands up. The downside, and what that video was about, was it's not waterproof. And if you want this thing to be a shelter from the storm, you really need something that's gonna hold back the rain. So I figured this was the perfect opportunity to try a waterproofing technique that you have all been mentioning in the comments section whenever I waterproof with beeswax or something. Basically, it consists of impregnating the fabric with silicone. To do this though, first we have to figure out exactly how much fabric we're working with by volume. An easy way to achieve this is just to stick it into a container that you know the measurements of and just see how much it fills up. Like my fabric compresses really tightly into this 2-gallon bucket. That gives me an easy measurement to start from. For the actual waterproofing process though, I'm actually gonna use this 5-gallon pail that I got from Lowe's. I'm using a garbage bag liner because I figured it'd be easier to be able to kind of take it out and mix up the materials that way without making too much of a mess. Speaking of the products I'm actually using to waterproof this thing, the main ingredients are this naphtha, which is an enamel and varnish thinner, and these tubes of 100% silicone. If you do decide to use a plastic bag to kind of stir this stuff up, make sure you dip a little bit of it in the naphtha just to make sure it doesn't actually eat through your bag. This stuff is really nasty, so make sure if you're working with it, you're in a really well ventilated area or just straight up outside. Also, do not put it anywhere near fire. It is the most flammable thing I've ever seen in my life. Not that I burned it at all. So seeing as I know my fabric took up 2 gallons worth of space, I want to fill my naphtha about 3/4 of that. So I end up using 1.5 of these gallon jugs that I picked up from the hardware store. Then to that, I emptied out 3 whole tubes of this silicone. Then I lifted the bag so I can just kind of mix it all together with my hands. Unfortunately, my bag was real thin and ended up springing a leak halfway through this. So I ended up resorting to just mixing the whole thing with a stick inside of that 5-gallon pail. After a while, the naphtha breaks down that silicone into this hateful witch's brew of syrupy goodness. At this point, I added in my fabric and just began kind of squishing it around in there. And because the naphtha is really bad for you, I ended up switching to these long chemical-safe gloves just to make sure I didn't get any on my skin. All you want to do is make sure all of the fabric soaks in this mixture. You don't want there to be any dry spots because that's where moisture is going to get in through. Once my coverage looked good, I brought it over to this clothesline that I set up between 2 trees and let it dry for 24 hours. And the first thing I noticed the next day was just how normal this fabric looked. Aside from the areas where I let the silicone cake on a bit strong, it just looked like regular fabric. I was honestly a little worried that all my hard work meant nothing. So to double check it, I put it in this tent-like configuration and just sprayed the hell out of it with my garden hose. And let me tell you, I was so ridiculously impressed with how well this worked. You can see water just kind of running off in little streams without actually soaking into the fabric. It even left these little puddles behind on the surface. Check out this shot. The front of the fabric completely soaked, but the back of it's bone dry. Again, so impressed with how well this works, and it doesn't weigh it down at all or make it incredibly flammable like my wax one. That's a really cool technique. Thank you all for sharing that with me. I like that. Okay, so the type of tent configuration I really want to go for is this kind of tarp tent right here. The smallest measurements people recommended it being was about 9 by 9. So that's what I'm gonna look for my tent to be because I don't want there to be too much fabric while it's in bag form. So with that in mind, I ended up removing 3 feet worth of fabric on one side, since this was a 9 by 12 tarp, which gives me that 9 by 9 measurement. I did leave a couple of extra inches so I can fold it over twice on that end, giving me this nice roll finish to that cut end. Then I just locked it into place with my sewing machine. Okay, so this tarp material is pretty good, it's pretty strong, but I didn't trust like cutting holes in it for grommets or just kind of stitching on little ribbons to use as tie down because I was afraid it would rip over time. So my thought is to kind of sandwich wherever I want a grommet between two pieces of leather and then drop a grommet in that way. That said, I wasn't exactly positive where I wanted those grommets to go. So to figure that out, I went outside and set this thing up in the configuration that I was looking for. To temporarily hold this down without grommets, I ended up busting out these rocks so I can use this little button trick. All you have to do is push the rock from the opposite side and then tie it in place through the tarp with a little bit of cordage. This gives me a secure button point to be able to tie everything down in the configuration I'm looking for. Then I use part of my Staff of the Wanderer just to hold up the center. This gave me this sweet little tent shape that has plenty of room to climb into. If you aren't familiar with how to do this tarp configuration, I wasn't at first, check out this video by Waypoint Survival. It's actually how I learned to make this tent. Link in the description below. With that set up how I wanted it, I went through with some tailor's chalk and just marked everywhere a grommet should go, or where I thought extra thick material was needed. Cool, so back at the shop, I cut out these little triangles to sandwich all of those corners of the tarp, and these little half rounds wherever a grommet falls along the edge. I also cut these round pieces of chrome tan just to reinforce where the pole will go, so it doesn't eventually wear its way through the top of the tent. All of these pieces were waterproof with some of this weatherproofing that I usually use for like leather boots. To attach these bits, I just added some contact cement to where the leather will sit on the fabric. I also added some to the back of those leather pieces. Then once they were tacky, I carefully matched the two together and pressed them into place. Then I was off to my leather sewing machine just to lock all of those pieces in. With those where I needed them, I just busted out some of these little grommets and then got to punching the holes through my leather. Then using the recommended anvil and striker, I set those grommets into place. Doing this now not only stops those grommets from tearing out, but also distributes the force across more of the fabric, hopefully stopping it from ripping or pulling. And as I said, I also added some of this chrome tan leather rounds just to stop that tent pole from wearing its way through the fabric. So aside from that center round there to stop the tent pole from coming through, about 1.5 feet back, I also added this other round with this tiny leather loop in it. Basically, once that tent is set up, I want an area to be able to pull the back just to give me a little bit more headroom, make that whole tent a little more roomy. You'll see more what I mean when I actually set up the tent. For now though, the tent part slash bag part of this whole thing is all set. We're gonna put that aside. Because before I can figure out how to kind of configure it into that bag part, I need to know how big I want that to be. And to know that, I need to know how big my little backpack frame that I'm gonna sit it on is gonna be. So let's get to making that frame. Now the whole thing's gonna be made up of these 7/8 oak dowels. And the first thing I needed to figure out is exactly how tall I wanted this backpack frame to be. To do that, I just put it against my back and grab with my hand where I thought the tip should lie. Not at all scientific here, but it does the trick. Then I cut them to length using my handsaw. Now there are a bunch of other cuts that go into this build, but they're all equally unscientifically taken. I just did what I thought felt right for like the width of my body and how big I wanted the little shelf on it to be. So rather than go through how to find those measurements, because just make them what you want, what feels comfortable, I'm just gonna tell you what the measurements were. So for me, I ended up with 3 of them at 12.5 inches, 2 at 25 inches, 2 at 4.5 inches, and 2 at 1.5 inches. Also, to connect everything together, I bought 6 of these 3/4 inch copper 90s. And 2 copper tees, also at 3/4 inches. And as you can see, those 3/4 inch fittings fit absolutely perfectly around those 7/8 dowels. Now to make this thing, I first put those 1.5 inch dowels into one end of a 90. Then on the other side of that 90, I added the 4-inch long dowel. I followed that up by another 90, which then connected to the 12.5 inch dowel. On the other side of that assembly, I just did the same thing with 2 90s connected by that 4-inch long dowel and ending off with that 1.5 inch piece. This is gonna end up being like the little tray at the bottom of my backpack frame that the bag will actually sit onto. Now to add more structure to that whole piece, I just put these T's on the end of those 1.5 inch long pieces. This allows me to use another one of our 12.5 inch pieces as a cross section to complete this shape. Now you can actually see that little shelf thing I'm talking about starting to come together. From here, it's a pretty simple task of just adding on those 25-inch long uprights to the ends of those T's and topping that off with these 90s, which are connected by the 12.5 inch piece. This gives us the whole shape of the frame that we're going for. All right, cool. So that bottom shelf section and also the top crossbar that holds the uprights together, I want those to be permanently connected to their fittings. I don't want them to come apart. But those uprights I do do want to come apart because they're gonna end up becoming our tent pole, which holds everything up. So first things first, to connect those permanent parts permanently together, I just use this trick that I've used a bunch of times where I drill straight through the fitting in the wood and all to the other side. Then I add in a nail. I did this to all of the fittings in that lower section and that little top crossbar as well. Next, I went ahead and nipped off some of the excess metal of that nail so that I can start peening it over with a ball peen hammer to make the top of a rivet. Once I got the top mushroomed out enough so that it wouldn't fit back through that hole, I flipped the whole thing over and cut away any of the excess metal, leaving just enough for me to peen down that side, riveting the whole piece in nice and tight, and then hammering it down nice and smooth. Doing that locks these fittings into place permanently and keeps that whole assembly from warping or twisting. All right, so those are now permanent. Again, though, I needed to figure out a way for those uprights to be able to hold strong enough because it's gonna support the whole backpack, but at the same time, come apart easily enough so that I can use it for the tent pole. And guys, not gonna lie, I'm really proud of what I came up with. All right, so check it out. First, I took one of my dowels that had this hole drilled into the top. Next, I took a length of this 14 gauge steel wire and fed it through that little hole. Then I simply twisted this wire around the dowel until it came past where that top bit exited out. Once there, I simply cut away all the excess. By doing this, I'm able to send this little bar of steel through the hole and then clip that spiral bit around the dowel. That spiral locks it around the dowel and stops that pin from being able to pull back out of that hole. Now I just remove it by springing it out a little bit and the whole assembly comes right off. To make this work on the pack frame, I simply drilled through the fittings and the dowel just like before. Then I send the straight end of my clip through and secure the whole thing into place, stopping those fittings from being able to come off of the dowels. After doing this to all 4 fittings, my pack frame was together and honestly really strong. Again, I'm very pleased with myself with how that came out. I'm gonna give myself one of these. Oh, one last thing I did on one of those uprights was actually slide this little coupling into place. This I kind of just leave on one of the dowels. A little bit of an afterthought, but honestly one of the most important pieces because that ends up being what sticks the 2 uprights together so the pole is tall enough to hold my tent up. You'll see later on, but yeah, that's a really important piece. All right, so at this point I have a backpack frame, but again, it's supposed to be a backpack frame, right? I need to be able to put it on like a backpack. So to figure out where to connect those straps, I just kind of positioned it onto my back and felt back behind me where I thought a strap should land. You know, from a lifetime of experience of wearing backpacks, you know about where that would be. Not scientific, but it works. So I figured the best way to attach like a little strap assembly so it wouldn't slide up and down on me was actually to use one of these little D-rings. I just used some bolt cutters to cut part of this D-ring in half. Then with a couple of pairs of pliers, I spread that wide open. Then at the spot on the dowels where I decided the strap should land, I drilled all the way through. With that hole in place, I simply positioned my stretched out D-ring there and used my pliers to close it back up again. Doing this gives me this really nice little connection point on both sides of the frame that I can use to hook my straps into. Super simple, but really strong. Speaking of those straps, I just cut some leather straps out, 4 of them 1/2 of an inch wide and about 4 feet long, and 2 of them 2 inches wide by about 2 feet long. These aren't going to be the final measurements, but this gave me enough leather to work with and get all of the strapping that I needed in place. What I ended up doing to attach everything was connecting these 6-inch long straps through those D-rings and locking them into place with some rapid rivets. Then on this roughly 2.5 foot long strap, I locked in this double D-ring assembly by just looping the leather around 2 D-rings and locking them in place with some rivets as well. This works just like a bicycle helmet where all you have to do is send the strap through both of those D-rings and then have it loop back around and go back through only the far ring. This causes a friction lock that only gets tighter the more you pull it. That works so nicely that I decided to add 2 more of that double D-ring assemblies down on the bottom rail of the pack. This will give me a nice place for those straps to connect into to form my backpack arm loops. Before connecting those though, I realized those thin like 1/2 inch straps were gonna be uncomfortable once they actually were carrying weight, right? It was gonna dig into me. So in order to help spread out that force a little bit, I simply cut some slits into this wider piece of leather here. This allows me to pass the thinner strips through one end and then back out the other end, giving me this wider piece of leather to help spread out that force a little bit. Then right around my chest area, I made a mark so that I knew exactly where to drop in some D-rings. This not only locks that wider piece into place, but also gives me these little loops that if I need to like tie them together to help me carry a heavier load, I can. With those ready to go, I just attach the strap to those double D-rings on the bottom, and boom, shoulder straps, baby, like a real backpack. The height on these things ended up feeling pretty perfect, and the width of the whole assembly felt really comfortable on my back. Also, these rings in the front were right where I'd want them to go if I wanted to tie everything together to help with the heavier load. I'm really excited with how cool this thing is coming out. Still, the space that's in the back not only makes it a little bit uncomfortable because then it's just like pulls against your back, but it also leaves a space for like the eventual bag that's gonna go there to fall through, right? So to get around this, I just end up tying some rope around the uprights. This not only gives me a little bit of extra support against my back, but also gives the bag something to lean against, adds some extra structure to the whole framework because it's pulling it in tight, and that rope ends up being the guy line I use later on for my tent. In fact, I also added a lot more rope to that bottom shelf area just to make sure it acted more like a shelf, and also because you know when you're camping, you may think you brought enough rope. You didn't. You always need more rope. Always more rope. Always. The last thing I need to make this thing actually work how I want it to is some straps to hold my bag into place. The simple solution was just to loop a bit of leather around one of the uprights and lock it into place with a rivet. On the other side of that strap, I just attached this belt buckle. Then on the other side of the backpack, I also locked in a bit of leather around the other upright. This one has belt holes to accept the buckle and make the whole thing adjustable. I ended up installing 2 pairs of these, giving myself plenty of belt to lock my bag into place. Now all I need is a bag. When we left our tent, it was still a tarp. A bag, tent, tarp, there's a lot going on here. I found the best way to turn that tarp into a bag was to start by folding it in half lengthwise. I then folded it up again 2/3 of the way. This will give me this nifty little pocket throughout the entire bag. Then I folded the 2 sides in towards the center, and then folded them in again so that they evenly overlapped one another. This gives me this nice little bag just the right width for my backpack. Every one of the layers from the fold makes another little pocket that I can store things separately from each other if needed. Then I can simply lock in the top by rolling it up and protect everything from weather. And this thing's a big old tarp. You can expand it as much as you need to fit whatever you want. Once you have the things you need in it, simply lay it down on the backpack frame and then lock it into place with my little belt straps. Then I wrap the top over the rope and tuck it back up into place to lock it in. And check that out, that's straight up a little backpack. Not only that, but it's really comfortable and sits super well on my shoulders. And once buckled in, if I want to add stuff to it, I just unwrap the top and open it up. From here, it works just like a regular old bag. I love how this thing came out. Not only that, but I can see a lot of room to add other stuff on. Like on those little belt straps, you can hang pouches so you don't have to take everything out of bags when you want to make it a tent. I also realized this little shelf here is just perfect for hanging my wool blanket to make it a real camping bag. Alright, so back to our little story from before. Here I am, a wanderer who finds himself in need to settle down for the night. After clearing out some space, I go ahead and empty the things out of my bag so I can get to setting up camp. My bag, having become this tarp, simply spreads over the ground so I can get to putting all of my stakes where I need them. Once that's locked down, it's back to my backpack frame to take out all my little pins so I can start making my tent pole. In a few minutes, I have the whole thing broken down, so I now find myself with the poles I need, as well as the guy lines I can use. I just slide my handy dandy coupling up, and now these 2 short poles become one long tent pole. A tent pole which I can use to easily prop up my living quarters. From here, it's a simple matter of attaching my guy lines in place to keep my tent flaps open. Finally, I unravel that long line from the bottom shelf of my backpack frame, and feed it through that loop I made a couple of feet back from my tent pole. This is then tied to a tree which raises the roof and gives me a lot more room to get comfortable. After that, it's a simple matter of setting up some ground cover, which I conveniently had left over from the material I cut out earlier, and laying down my blanket. Now I'm ready to camp out for the night in my very own spacious tent. Seriously, there's enough room to sleep 2 people comfortably in this thing, 4 if you're really intense snuggle, and also enough for me to sit up and do all of the camp things I need to do away from the rain. This was a really cool build. I love these multi-purpose things, and this one is just, it's so cool. And honestly, it's my interaction with you guys in the community that makes things like this happen. This was one of your ideas. So thank you for being part of this community and continually inspiring me. Now, I hope you liked this project. If you did, why don't you consider giving me some of that like it love, and don't forget to subscribe so you know when I release new content. Now, as a side note, I'd like you to leave in the comment section how I did in the presentation of this one. I often get comments saying that I'm either like too energetic or too loud during these. To get better at this, I've used today's sponsor, Skillshare, to take an acting class. Thanks to Skillshare, I've been able to master the techniques used by stage actors to up my presence and tone of voice and all that. Okay, Maddie, a quick editing note. Here, I'm gonna stand in front of a green screen and like do some monologues and stuff. All I need you to do is just make me look epic, like, you know, leaves falling around me or something. I don't know, figure it out. You have creative freedom here.
Thankfully, I also use Skillshare. I had been using this course by Phil Ebner, Video Editing in Adobe Premiere Pro, a Beginner to Advanced course, to round out my editing skills. But when Clever drops demands last minute, it helps to jump ahead and crank the video speed up. So, if you have coworkers like Clever, consider joining up. The first 1,000 people to use the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. You can learn to do some pretty cool things in a day, let alone a month.
We band of brothers, for he who sheds his blood today with me shall be my brother. And scene. Dramatic readings by Clever. I hope you enjoyed my incredible acting. There's more where that came from. In the meantime, though, keep leveling up, you. You made it to the end screen. The YouTube algorithm loves it when you do that. Watching a video all the way through is a fantastic way to support this channel. If you're looking for other ways to support this channel, you can consider joining these incredible people. These are my Patreons, and without them, this just doesn't happen. They are the ones who keep this channel running. If you'd like to join their noble ranks, why don't you consider joining our Patreon? Link in the description below. Another way to support this channel, though, is just by clicking on one of these videos here that YouTube thinks you'd like. I'm partial to the one on the right, but the one on the left's pretty good too. I think you should check them both out. Backpack. I'm going on a journey in my backpack. Backpack. Backpack.